A cold wind circles an ancient courtyard, carrying dust, whispers, and the murmur of hundreds holding their breath. In the center stands a single stone, scarred by time, half buried in frost, and lodged deep within it, a sword no warrior has ever been able to claim. The strongest have tried, the proudest have failed, and the kingdom, fractured and trembling, waits for a sign that hope has not yet died. But destiny rarely chooses the obvious. And from the edge of the crowd steps a young boy, quiet, unnoticed, too small to matter in the eyes of kings, who will soon attempt what legends say cannot be done. This is the beginning of an age of wonder, of a crown taken not by birth, but by worth. Of Camelot rising from ruin into a beacon of unity, justice, and fragile peace. And it all begins with a single breath, a single touch, on a sword that refuses everyone. Except him. If you were standing there watching the frost drift off that ancient blade, would your eyes be on the weapon no one could move? Or on the boy no one believed in? And if you'd like more journeys into legendary history, gently tap like and subscribe so the stories never fade. Now dim your screen, let the night close in as we travel back to the beginning, to the boy shaped by the ruins of Rome long before he ever touched the sword in the stone. The rain had fallen for days across the western hills, soft and unending, as though the sky itself mourned the world that was slipping away. Once, these roads had echoed with the iron rhythm of Roman soldiers, their shields flashing beneath banners of crimson and gold. Now, only moss crept between the stones the empire had withdrawn, its legions called home to defend a crumbling heart. In their absence, Britain was left to the wind and the wolves. In the borderlands between what was Rome and what was wilderness, a small village clung to the earth. Huts of wattle and clay leaned into one another for warmth. Smoke curled thinly from their thatched roofs, carrying with it the scent of peat and barley. Inside one such hut, a woman whispered a prayer in both Latin and the old tongue. For even prayers were uncertain now, split between two worlds. In her arms lay a boy, no more than a few months old, his breath light as mist. They called him Artorius, a name half Roman, half something older. His mother said the name meant bear-like, strong, enduring, but to her it was simply the sound of hope. His father, a soldier of the fading legions, had vanished before the child could remember his face. Some said he fell in battle against northern raiders. Others whispered that he had returned to the continent when the legions withdrew. Whatever the truth, the boy would grow in a world without certainty. The village elder, a grey-haired man who still wore the tattered cloak of a Roman official, tried to keep the old order alive. He taught the children the Latin letters etched on his wooden tablet, though his voice trembled when he spoke of laws that no longer held power. "Remember," he would tell them, tracing the faded lines, "we were once a province of Rome, a light in the western sea." But outside, the wild hills laughed softly, as if to remind them that Rome's light had gone out long ago. When Artorius was old enough to walk, he followed the streams down into the valleys, where the ruins of old villas lay half buried beneath ivy and soil. He would run his hands along the carved stones and wonder about the people who had once lived there, people who spoke in a language he barely understood, who built baths and temples, and who believed the world could be ordered by reason and law. Sometimes he imagined hearing their footsteps echoing in the corridors, their laughter faint in the wind. At night, by the fire, his mother told him stories, not of emperors or generals, but of heroes from before Rome came. Bran the Blessed, who crossed the sea on a giant's head, Lulor Giffers, who turned into an eagle to escape death, and Merlin, the mad prophet who spoke with the trees. Her voice was soft, and her eyes shone in the glow of the flames. "Remember these tales," she would whisper. "They belong to us. Rome will fade, but our stories remain." Years passed. Artorius grew tall, his shoulders broad from helping the villagers mend walls until the stony fields. But he carried within him a restlessness, a feeling that the land itself was waiting for something. He could sense it in the way the mists lingered over the moors at dawn, in the hush that came before the cry of a raven, in the shimmer of light on the river when the sun broke through clouds. It was as if Britain was holding its breath. One winter evening, a stranger arrived. He came on foot, wrapped in a cloak of dark wool, a staff in his hand. His hair was white, his eyes bright as frost. The villagers gathered in silence as he entered the firelight. "I seek the boy called Artorius," he said, in a voice that seemed to carry the weight of both command and kindness. Artorius stepped forward, unsure whether to bow or speak. The stranger looked at him for a long moment, as if reading not his face, but the space behind it, the shape of his future. "You are the child of both worlds," the man murmured, "of the eagle and the bear. Do you know what that means?" Artorius shook his head. "It means the old world is not finished," the stranger said. "It sleeps, waiting for hands strong enough to lift it again." The boy felt his heart quicken. "And who are you?" The stranger smiled faintly. "Some call me Merlin. Others have forgotten my name, but I remember yours." He stayed the night in the elder's hut, and before dawn he was gone, leaving behind only a carved token, a small circle of wood with the image of a dragon upon it. Artorius kept it always, though he never spoke of it. As seasons turned, war crept closer. The Saxons came first, in scattered bands, their ships gliding up the river mouths, their laughter harsh and foreign. Then came the painted Picts from the north, fierce and tireless. The land seemed to tear itself apart. Warlords rose and fell like the tides, each claiming to be the saviour of Britain. Villages burned. Forts crumbled. And through it all, Artorius became a man. He learned to fight not for glory, but for survival. The sword he carried was old, its edge dulled by years of use. Yet when he held it, he felt something stir, not pride, but purpose. In the clang of iron and the cry of battle, he heard an echo of something ancient and enduring. One night, after a skirmish in the borderlands, he found himself standing among the ruins of an old Roman fort. The walls were broken, the towers gone, but the stones still held their pattern. Order within ruin. The moonlight spilled across the ground, and for a moment he saw not destruction, but potential. It could be rebuilt, he whispered to himself, all of it. He did not yet know that this thought, small and fleeting, would become the seed of Camelot. Years later, the people would tell stories of how a sword appeared in a stone, waiting for the one true king. But long before that, there was this moment, a young man in the moonlight, dreaming not of conquest, but of unity. He began to gather others like him, men and women weary of endless bloodshed, who longed for peace, for justice, They built small defences, repaired bridges, cleared roads, bit by bit. They stitched the land together again. Some called him a fool, a dreamer chasing the ghost of Rome. But others saw in him something stronger, a spark that could light even the darkest corners of a broken island. When spring returned, Artorius climbed the western hill above his village. From there, he could see the river winding silver through the valley, the smoke of distant hearths rising into the cool air. He thought of his mother's stories, of Myrddin's strange visit, of the endless tides of war, and he whispered to the wind, "Britain will not die." The wind answered softly through the heather, carrying with it the scent of rain and hope. Down in the valley, the old Roman road still waited beneath the moss. One day, his footsteps would follow it far beyond the hills, to battles, to love, to legend. But for now, the boy from the ruins of Rome stood in silence, listening to the quiet heartbeat of his homeland. The age of Arthur had not yet begun. But in that moment, in that stillness between the storms, the dream of Britain began to breathe again. Years passed. The hills of Britain rolled beneath the same grey skies, their mists rising and falling like breath. The boy who had once wandered the ruins of Rome had become a man, quiet, steady, shaped by hardship. His hair was the colour of late autumn, his eyes clear as river water. Those who knew him spoke of his patience, his fairness, and a strange quiet strength that drew others close. But the land around him remained wounded. The Saxon raids had grown bold. Villages vanished overnight, their hearths cold and silent by dawn. The kings of Britain, small lords who called themselves rulers, fought among each other for scraps of power. In every direction, the dream of unity seemed more like a ghost than a future. Still, Artorius, now simply Arthur, refused to surrender that dream. He had begun to travel beyond his valley, gathering those who believed that honour might still have a place in this broken world. They were a modest band, a stonemason, a farmer, a healer, a few weary soldiers. But they shared one purpose: to protect rather than conquer. They repaired bridges where none would pass, cleared roads choked by brambles, helped rebuild the walls of burned villages. It was not glory that moved them, but decency, the belief that kindness, once restored, might grow again like grass after frost. In those years, word began to spread of a gathering, a great council to be held near the ancient city of Londinium, where the remaining lords of Britain would decide the future of the island. Some came for peace, some for power, and some merely to see who might fall first. Arthur went as well, though he had little title and no army. His companions warned him that he would not be welcomed, yet he felt compelled to go. "If there is even one chance to speak for unity," he said softly, "then I must take it." The journey took them through forests where the trees grew thick as cathedrals, their branches heavy with moss. Streams cut through the undergrowth, whispering secrets to those who paused to listen. Along the way, Arthur thought often of his mother's words. "Rome will fade, but our stories remain." He wondered whether he was now living a story that would be remembered, or one that would vanish like the mist at morning. When they reached Londinium, they found it a city half alive, half dead. Roman walls still rose from the earth, but ivy coiled over their broken edges. The once busy forum was now a marketplace of tents and carts, filled with shouting traders, soldiers, monks, and beggars. Among the noise and smoke stood the remains of a temple, its marble columns stained by time, its altar empty. It was there that the council gathered. One by one, the lords of Britain arrived, cloaked in furs, armoured in pride. They argued of boundaries, of tribute, of old grievances that had never healed. "We need a strong king," cried one. "A single hand to hold this land together," shouted another. Yet when the question came, who should it be? The hall fell silent. None could agree. Each claimed descent from some noble line. Each believed himself chosen by fate. Voices rose again in anger. And then, when the air seemed ready to break, an old man stepped forward. His cloak was plain, but his eyes gleamed with the depth of knowing. Some whispered his name, Mordred. Others called him Merlin. "Lords of Britain," he said calmly, "you quarrel over a crown no one yet deserves. The land does not need another lord. It needs a soul strong enough to serve it." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "And where is such a soul to be found?" demanded one chieftain. Merlin's gaze lifted toward the doorway. "Outside this hall," he said, "there stands a stone, ancient and true. In it rests a sword none have been able to draw. Let the one whom destiny favours take it freely, without force or deceit. Then you will know your king." The hall erupted in disbelief. Some laughed, others cursed. Yet curiosity, like fire, spreads quickly. By midday, a crowd had gathered in the square before the old temple. There it stood, a great stone, half buried in earth, its surface scarred by centuries of rain and frost. From its heart rose a sword, not new, but timeless, its blade catching the pale winter light. Across its crossguard, letters were carved in the tongue of the old empire. "Whoso pulleth out this sword from this stone is rightwise born king of all Britain." One by one the lords stepped forward. Their hands gripped the hilt, their arms strained. Yet the sword would not move. Sweat ran down their faces, curses filled the air. When all had failed, silence returned. Then, from the edge of the crowd, a soft voice spoke. "May I try?" The people turned. It was Arthur, still dressed in a simple cloak, his belt holding no weapon finer than a worn dagger. Laughter rippled through the onlookers. "A peasant's son?" one sneered. "Let him try. Perhaps the stone will pity him." Arthur stepped forward, feeling the weight of 100 eyes. He touched the hilt, not with force, but with reverence, as one might touch a relic or a promise. The metal was cold beneath his fingers. For a moment, he closed his eyes. He thought of his mother's prayers, of the ruins of Rome, of the countless faces of those who had suffered without hope. Then gently he drew the sword upward. It came free as if it had merely been waiting, not for strength, but for sincerity. The sound was like wind through a chapel, soft, endless, and filled with awe. The crowd fell silent. Even the laughter died, replaced by the low murmur of disbelief. The blade gleamed in Arthur's hand, catching the faint sun that pierced the clouds. Merlin stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Behold," he said quietly, "the hand that heals the land." But not all were ready to believe. Some cried trickery, others treason. The lords demanded another test, and another. Yet each time the sword returned to the stone, only Arthur could draw it forth. Still, there was no crown placed upon his head that day. Britain was too fractured, too proud to accept one man so easily. Arthur returned to his camp outside the city, the sword at his side, unsure what it truly meant. That night, he sat beside the fire, the blade resting across his knees. Its surface reflected the flames like water, and for a moment he thought he saw shapes within it. The faint outline of towers, of banners, of a city not yet built. He felt neither triumph nor fear, but a deep, quiet calling. Merlin came to him in the stillness. "You are troubled," the old man said. Arthur nodded. "They do not believe." "They will," Merlin replied. "But faith must grow like a tree. It cannot be forced." Arthur traced a finger along the blade. "Why me?" he asked softly. "There are others stronger, wiser." "Because you do not seek the crown," said Merlin, "and that is what makes you worthy of it." The fire crackled between them. Beyond the circle of light, the night stretched wide and silent, filled with unseen stars. Over the next seasons, word spread through the valleys and hills of the young man who had drawn the sword that none could move. Some called it a miracle, others a lie. Yet across the troubled land, hope began to stir like spring beneath the frost. In the northern marshes, a mother told her children that maybe peace would come again. In the western hills, shepherds spoke of a new leader who might unite the tribes. And in the ruined fort where Arthur had once stood dreaming of rebuilding, a few weary men gathered once more, ready to follow him. He did not call himself king. He called himself servant of the land, of the people, of something greater than any single man. When next he returned to the great hall of Londinium, he did not come alone. Behind him rode those who had once been enemies, Celts, Britons, even a few Roman-born men who still carried the discipline of their fathers. They came not for conquest, but for unity. This time, when he entered the hall, the sword at his side seemed to speak for him. No words were needed. And so it was that in the fading light of a weary Briton, a young leader began to rise, not by birthright, but by belief. The sword that had once rested in stone was now in the hands of one who understood its true weight. Outside, the mists thickened over the city. Somewhere, a bell tolled softly, marking the end of one age and the beginning of another. Arthur lifted his gaze to the horizon, where the clouds parted just enough to reveal a pale streak of dawn. "We will build again," he whispered, "not for glory, but for peace." Merlin's voice, low and steady, answered him from the shadows. "Then, my king, the work begins." The sound of the bell faded, replaced by the wind sighing through the broken columns. And thus, in the twilight between myth and memory, the sword found its keeper, and Britain at last began to remember itself. The dawn after the sword was drawn came quietly. No horns, no fanfare, only mist drifting over the hills and the hush of distant bells. In a small camp outside Londinium, Arthur stood before his companions as the first light brushed the edges of their cloaks. The sword hung at his side, its metal dull in the grey morning, yet there was something alive in it, as though the blade itself breathed softly with the rising sun. He had not slept. Every sound, every flicker of the fire had reminded him of the choice ahead. Britain was watching, waiting to see whether the boy with no crown could hold a kingdom together by will alone. "I am no king," he said to those gathered. Bedwyr the steadfast, Kai the quick-tempered but loyal, and Gwenwyfach the healer who had followed them from the valleys. "I have no line, no right, no throne." Bedwyr looked up from where he sat sharpening his blade. "Then make one," he said simply. "If there is none to inherit, then let one be forged. Arthur smiled faintly, though doubt still lingered in his chest. Forged from what? From what we have, Bedwyr said. Stone, sweat, and a bit of faith. That morning, as they prepared to leave for Camlann, the old Roman fortress on the river Usk, Arthur rode slowly through the ruins of the city. Merchants bowed their heads, children peered from doorways, and the old folk whispered prayers in tongues that mixed Latin with the words of older gods. They did not yet call him king, but they called him Hope, and that was enough. The journey westward took weeks. Winter yielded reluctantly to spring, and the land softened under rain. They passed through fields where ploughmen guided oxen through mud, through forests thick with birdsong and the scent of wild garlic. In every village, Arthur listened to the fears, the hunger, the long memories of war. He asked not for tribute, but for trust. At Camelot, an ancient city of stone walls and broken amphitheatres, they made camp. Once, Roman governors had ruled from this place. Now ivy climbed over the statues of emperors, and sheep grazed where crowds had once cheered. Yet beneath the decay, the bones of strength remained. Arthur saw in its wide courtyards and solid foundations the beginnings of something new. This, he said to his companions, is where we will begin again. And so they began to rebuild. Stones from fallen villas were hauled to raise new walls. Roofs were thatched, gates repaired, and watchfires lit along the river. Men came from distant valleys to lend their hands, drawn not by gold, but by the quiet conviction of the young leader who worked beside them, sweating as they did. When food was short, Arthur shared his portion. When disputes rose, he listened with patience until the anger burned itself out. In those long days of labour, the name Arthur began to carry a weight of its own. Not the weight of command, but of trust. One evening, as dusk painted the fortress in violet hues, Merlin appeared once more. He did not come with ceremony, only a walking staff and a knowing smile. "You've built much," he said, watching the workers below. "But you have not yet built the thing that will last." Arthur wiped the dust from his hands. "You mean walls?" "I mean belief," said Merlin. "A kingdom of stones can crumble in a season. A kingdom of hearts endures through centuries." Arthur looked out over the river. "And how does one build that?" "With justice," Merlin said softly, "and with humility. The people must not kneel to you in fear. They must stand beside you in trust." He tapped the ground with his staff. "Tomorrow the lords will come. They will offer crowns and treaties and chains in the same breath. Remember what you are, the servant of the land." Arthur bowed his head. "I will remember." The next day, riders arrived from across Britain, chieftains from the north, bishops from the west, even Roman-born nobles who still clung to titles from an empire long gone. They filled the great hall of Camlann, its roof newly mended, its air thick with smoke and expectation. Arthur entered without armour, wearing only a simple cloak and the sword at his side. He greeted each man with the same calm respect, though some refused to meet his eyes. At the hall's centre stood a rough-hewn table of oak, scarred and sturdy. A symbol, Merlin said, of the world they were trying to rebuild. An old bishop stepped forward, his robes frayed at the edges. "Young man," he said gravely, "if you would be king, you must swear upon this sword to uphold the peace of God and the justice of men." Arthur drew the sword, its edge catching the light from the torches. "I swear," he said, "that I will rule not for myself, but for those who have no voice. I will serve the land as it has served me, through storm and silence." The hall grew still. Even the proudest lords felt the weight of his words. Then Bedwyr stepped forward, holding a crown of beaten gold. It was not ornate, no jewels, no silver, only a circle of plain metal, shaped by a blacksmith's hand. He placed it upon Arthur's head, and in that moment the murmurs faded into quiet reverence. No trumpet sounded, no crowds roared, only the soft hum of wind through the hall and the steady rhythm of a single heart accepting its burden. Merlin's voice broke the silence. "Behold not a lord, but a leader, not a tyrant, but a keeper of peace." And so, in the broken fortress of Camlann, Arthur was crowned king of the Britons, not by bloodline, but by belief. In the days that followed, messengers rode out from Camlann to every corner of the island. Some brought gifts of grain to hungry villages. Others carried letters calling the tribes to unity. Slowly, the fires of war began to dim. It was not peace, not yet, but it was something like breathing after a long storm. Arthur sat often in the courtyard, watching the sun set beyond the walls. He spoke with scholars who remembered the old Roman laws, with druids who tended the sacred groves, with farmers who knew the moods of the soil. He listened, always listening, weaving their knowledge into something that belonged to everyone. And in time, the people began to speak of a dream, a place where all might come as equals, where justice could be weighed without pride or fear. They called it, at first, the King's Circle. In later years, it would become known as the Round Table. But for now, it was only an idea, a hope taking shape like mist over water. One night, as spring melted into summer, Arthur walked the ramparts alone. The stars shimmered faintly above the river, and the air carried the scent of wet stone and wild thyme. From the fields below came the distant sound of laughter, his people, celebrating after a day's hard work. Merlin joined him, stepping out of the shadows as he often did. "You hear them," he said quietly. "That sound, that is what makes a kingdom." Arthur smiled faintly. "They laugh because they believe tomorrow will come." "And it will," Merlin said, "because you have given them reason to believe it." The king looked toward the horizon, where the faint glow of campfires marked distant settlements. "Do you think it will last?" he asked. "This peace?" Merlin did not answer at once. "All things fade," he said finally, "but some leave echoes that never die. Build your kingdom not in stone, but in spirit, and it will outlive us all." They stood together in silence, the wind stirring their cloaks, the river whispering below. In that stillness, Arthur felt the quiet truth of it, that his reign would not be measured by years or battles, but by the simple dignity of those who could sleep safely under its light. By midsummer, Camlann had changed. The fields were green again. Children ran freely through the streets, and the once crumbling walls now gleamed with fresh lime. The people spoke of Arthur with warmth, not as a distant ruler, but as a neighbour who shared their burdens. And yet, deep within him, the young king knew how fragile it all was. Peace, he thought, is not a crown to wear, but a flame to guard. It must be tended daily, with patience, with fairness, with love. When he knelt that night beside his bed, the sword lay within reach. Its hilt glowed faintly in the firelight. if I am to lead," he whispered, "let it be with gentleness. If I am to fight, let it be only for what is right." Outside, the moon rose over the fortress, soft and full. The sound of the river folded into the rhythm of night, steady and eternal. And far beyond Caerleon, in the deep green heart of Britain, the land itself seemed to stir, as though it too had begun to dream again. The first years of Arthur's reign were quiet ones, years of work, not war. There were no songs yet, no shining armour, no banners in the wind, only the sound of hammers on stone, the ring of chisels, and the murmuring of voices joined in labour. From Caerleon, the king's men rode across the island, gathering builders, masons, and carpenters. They came from every corner of Britain, Celts with the strength of the western hills, Saxons who had laid down their spears, even the few Romans who still remembered the geometry of empire. Each carried something different: skill, hope, and the faint belief that this time, perhaps, peace might last. Arthur himself rode among them, never asking for what he would not do. When the stones were hauled through mud and rain, his hands were there to lift them. When the night fires burned low, he shared their bread, and slowly, from that shared effort, something extraordinary began to take shape. It was Merlin who first led Arthur to the place where the new city would rise. They travelled north through valleys still veiled in morning mist, where rivers curved like silver ribbons through the meadows. After days of quiet journeying, they came to a broad plain, bordered by dark woods and open sky. In the centre stood a low hill, crowned with wildflowers and hawthorn trees. "This is the place," Merlin said, his voice calm but certain. Arthur looked across the land, to the glinting river, the green expanse, the hills that seemed to cradle the horizon. "It is beautiful," he said softly. "It is more than that," replied Merlin. "It is balanced, between forest and field, between river and stone. The heart of Britain lies here. Build wisely, and it will outlast empires." And so the dream of Camelot was born, not in fanfare, but in stillness. The building began in spring. First came the clearing of the hill, the cutting of timber, the shaping of stone. Each day the sound of work echoed across the plain, steady, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of something coming alive. Arthur designed no throne room, no tower of vanity. Instead, he ordered a great hall with wide windows to welcome the morning light, and doors that would remain open to all who sought counsel. Around it, smaller dwellings grew, homes for the workers, stables for the horses, gardens for food and herbs. There were times when the weather turned against them. Rains flooded the trenches, winds tore at scaffolds, and some whispered that the gods were testing the king's resolve. But Arthur never faltered. "Every stone we place," he told his men, "is a promise kept to those who will come after us." By midsummer, the first walls rose strong against the sky. From a distance, they looked almost golden in the sun, their surfaces smooth, yet warm to the touch. Birds nested in the eaves. Children chased each other through unfinished courtyards, and the air filled with laughter. Merlin often walked the grounds in silence, his eyes tracing the lines of shadow and light. "A city built in harmony with the land," he murmured. "Perhaps even the wind will find peace here." It was during those early days that Arthur's counsel began to take form. There was Bedware, still his closest companion, loyal as ever, practical and unshakable. Kai, his foster brother, who oversaw the training of the guards Gwenhwyfall, whose wisdom in healing and herbs had already saved countless lives. And others too, knights and thinkers, poets and priests, each bringing something vital to the growing kingdom. One evening, they gathered in the half-built hall to discuss matters of law. The flickering light of torches danced on the walls, still unadorned with banners. "The people need a symbol," said Bedwyr. "Something to remind them that this peace belongs to everyone, not only to those who wear crowns." Arthur nodded. "Yes, a symbol that says we are equals in purpose." He looked around the room, at the men and women sitting in a loose circle, each speaking in turn. No one above another. Then he smiled. "We will meet like this always, in a circle. No head, no foot, no throne for the king, no lesser place for the rest. A table, round as the earth itself." They agreed at once, and thus began the earliest idea of the round table, not yet carved, not yet named, but alive in spirit. It would take years before it stood in polished oak, gleaming under the torches. But even now, in the hush of that unfinished hall, its presence was already felt. A promise of fairness, of listening, of shared purpose. Summer ripened into autumn. Camelot grew. Travellers who passed through spoke of it as a city unlike any other. Its walls did not close people out, but welcomed them in. Music echoed from its courtyards at night. Soft pipes, low drums, the steady beat of feet on stone markets, filled with voices in a dozen tongues. Monks copied old texts by candlelight, while farmers traded barley and honey. It was said that within those walls, no man went hungry, no woman went unheard. And though not all tales were true, enough were that the legend began to take root. Arthur moved among his people quietly, rarely using the title of king. When disputes arose, he would listen before he judged, his manner calm, his words deliberate. "We will build a kingdom," he told them, "not of walls and crowns, but of trust." And so they did. Yet even in peace, shadows lingered. Beyond the forests to the east, Saxon bands still gathered, restless and envious. Rumours of raids reached Camelot like distant thunder. And within the hearts of some men, old rivalries smouldered. One night, as the king and Merlin walked beneath the moonlit ramparts, the old sage spoke quietly. "You have built something rare," he said. "But remember, every light draws its shadow." Arthur paused. "You mean enemies?" "Not only enemies," Merlin said. "Doubt, pride, fear, they grow as swiftly as vines upon stone. You must tend to them, or they will one day crack what you have built." Arthur looked out across the fields, where the new city glimmered softly in the moonlight. "Then I will tend it," he said. "Every day, if I must." Merlin smiled faintly. That is the burden of every good king. Winter came early that year. Frost traced the windows of Camelot's hall, and the river froze at its edges. But inside, fires burned warm, and songs filled the air. The people celebrated the first festival of the new kingdom, a feast of light and gratitude. They brought what they could: roasted grain, wild apples, fish from the river. Children recited old tales, elders blessed the young. And when all had eaten their fill, Arthur rose to speak. He held no sceptre, wore no crown, only the simple cloak he had worn since the days of Camlann. "My friends," he said, his voice carrying gently over the quiet crowd, "this is not my hall, it is ours. Camelot belongs to all who labour, all who believe that peace can be built by hands, not by swords. He paused, his eyes drifting toward the great wooden table now standing at the hall's center, round and plain, but perfect. Let this circle remind us that no seat is higher than another, and no voice too small to be heard. May it hold us together when the winds rise again. A murmur of assent filled the hall, soft as the turning of a page. Outside, snow began to fall, silent and slow, blanketing the roofs, the walls, the fields beyond. It covered the marks of labor and the scars of the past, leaving only a quiet white stillness. Merlin, standing near the doorway, watched it with a distant gaze. "A pure beginning," he whispered, "but beginnings are fragile things." Arthur heard him and nodded. "Then let us guard it well." That night, as the fire dimmed and the people slept, the king walked alone through the half-lit corridors. He ran his hand along the cold stone, feeling its strength, its endurance. In the silence, he could almost hear the hum of life within it, the pulse of a dream slowly finding form. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft as breath. The world was hushed, resting, and far away, beyond the borders of his peace, men stirred in darkness, men who would one day test everything he had built. But for now, Camelot stood whole beneath the moon, new, shining and untroubled, a promise in stone, and in its heart a young king slept, dreaming not of glory, but of keeping what he had made alive for just one more day. By the time Camelot's towers gleamed pale against the dawn, the people spoke of their king with warmth. But always, in quiet tones, they also spoke of the wise man who had walked beside him from the beginning, Merlin. The name drifted through taverns and temples alike, half legend, half truth. Some said he was the son of a druid and a Roman nun. Others swore he was older than memory, born of the wind itself. In every telling, though, one thing remained the same. Wherever Arthur went, Merlin's shadow followed. Not dark, but calm, long, and watchful. It was early spring when he returned to Camelot after many months wandering the wild hills. The mists clung low that morning, curling around the ramparts like breath guards saw him first, a figure in a grey cloak walking with unhurried steps, his staff glinting faintly in the light. He entered through the eastern gate without a word, as though he had never left. Arthur was in the courtyard, speaking with the stonemasons about the next phase of construction. When he saw the old man, he smiled, weary but genuine. "You vanish for a season," the king said, "and return as if you've merely stepped out for bread." Merlin's eyes twinkled. "And you've been busy turning dreams into stone. Tell me, have you left any work for the rest of us?" Arthur laughed softly. "Only the impossible tasks." Merlin tilted his head. "Ah, those are my favourite kind." That evening, the court gathered for supper in the great hall. The air shimmered with the warmth of torches, and laughter mingled with the sound of spoons against clay. Merlin sat beside the king, saying little, but watching much. His presence seemed to steady the room, as though his quiet gaze alone could smooth away discord. When the meal was done, Arthur leaned toward him. "You've seen much of Britain in your travels. What do you see coming for us?" Merlin traced a line in the air with one long finger, as though writing on invisible parchment. "The land is restless," he said. "Peace is young and easily broken. There are men beyond your borders who watch what you build, and envy it. And there are storms that do not come from sky or sea, but from the hearts of men. Arthur's brow furrowed. You speak of enemies. Not only of enemies, said Merlin gently. Greatness draws both loyalty and temptation. Remember, even light casts shadows. The king nodded slowly. Then I will keep my eyes open. Merlin smiled faintly. Keep your heart open too. It will be harder. In the months that followed, Merlin became more than an advisor. To the builders, he was a teacher, showing them how to read the grain of wood and the pattern of stars to set their foundations true. To the farmers, he was a friend, teaching the ways of the moon and soil. And to the children, he was simply the storyteller, the old man with the gentle voice who spoke of dragons that guarded rivers and owls that remembered the secrets of Rome. He never sought reverence, only curiosity. The world, he would tell them, is wiser than we are. All we must do is listen. Sometimes he would lead Arthur beyond the walls at dawn. They would walk in silence through the dewy grass, following the river until they reached the high hills, where the fog broke open to reveal the valley below. There he would speak softly, almost to himself. This land, he said once, has memory. It remembers the tread of Roman legions, the songs of the Celts, the cries of battle and the laughter of children. It remembers kindness as well as cruelty. If we wish to rule it well, we must remember too. Arthur looked out over the valley. And if we forget? Merlin's gaze drifted toward the horizon. Then the land will remind us, one way or another. As summer deepened, new faces began to arrive at Camelot. Knights seeking purpose, scholars seeking refuge. Even kings from distant regions came to see the city that had risen from ruin. They found not marble palaces or gold, but something rarer, a place of fairness. Merlin watched them all, quietly measuring their hearts. Among them was a young knight named Lancelot, newly come from the coast of Armorica. He was tall, with eyes like clear steel, and a voice that carried calm authority. Arthur welcomed him warmly, sensing both skill and grace. But Merlin, ever the watcher, saw something else, a flicker, faint and unformed, that would one day burn too bright. That night, as the hall emptied, Merlin approached the king. This new knight, he said softly, walks with purpose, but also with longing. He will be both your greatest strength and your deepest wound. Arthur frowned. You speak as though destiny were a trap. It is not a trap, Merlin said, but a pattern. We are free to weave it, yet the threads are old. The king sighed. Then we shall weave with care. One morning, as the sun lifted over the river, Merlin gathered a group of the young knights outside the walls. He placed a bowl of water before them and spoke. Tell me, what do you see? Nothing, one said. My reflection, said another. Ripples, said a third. Merlin nodded. Yes, and so it is with truth. Each of you sees something different, and none see the whole. Remember this when you sit at the king's table, for unity is not agreement, but understanding. Arthur, watching from a distance, felt a quiet pride. Camelot was not only growing in stone and lore, but in wisdom. By late autumn, the city gleamed under a cool sky. The river glided silver through its bridges, and fires burned gently in every hearth. Yet even amid peace, Merlin's gaze often turned northward. One night, Arthur found him standing on the parapet, his cloak stirring in the wind. You're restless, the king said. Merlin nodded. Change is coming. It always does. You cannot build without inviting the test. Arthur looked toward the dark hills. Then we will face it when it comes. Merlin's eyes softened. That is why I chose you. You face what others flee. The king smiled faintly. And you? What do you face, old friend? The same thing we all must, Merlin said. The cost of what we love. He turned away then, his staff tapping lightly against the stone. Below them, the lamps of Camelot flickered like stars fallen to earth. The air smelled of rain and oak smoke, the scent of endurance, of something newly begun, yet already ancient. As the night deepened, Arthur walked alone through the hall where the great round table stood. He traced his hand across its surface. Smooth, polished, eternal. Around it would sit knights of every border and faith, sworn not to rule, but to serve. He thought of Merlin's words, of destiny, of patterns, of love's inevitable cost. And though he could not yet see the shape of what was coming, he felt its quiet weight in his heart. Outside, the wind rose, whispering through the narrow windows. Somewhere in the hills, an owl cried, a sound both mournful and wise. In that sound, Arthur heard a truth as old as Britain itself. Peace is never a gift freely given. It is a vow, renewed each dawn by those who choose to keep believing. And so he did. The sound of hammers faded from Camelot's courtyards, replaced by the softer rhythm of daily life. Hooves on cobblestones, bells from distant chapels, the laughter of children echoing across the walls. The kingdom had entered its first true season of calm. For the first time in years, Britain's air carried not the smoke of battle, but the scent of hearth fires and bread. Yet Arthur knew peace could not stand on silence alone. It needed guardians, not just warriors, but souls bound by honor, reason, and compassion. And so, one spring morning, he summoned his most trusted companions to the great hall, where the sunlight streamed through high windows, glinting off the polished oak of the round table. They came as they always did, Bedwyr, sturdy and thoughtful, Kai, fierce and loyal, Gwenhwyfach, healer and counsellor, and others now gathered from across Britain, noblemen, scholars, soldiers who had laid down their swords for justice. Among them, newly seated, was Lancelot of Armorica, whose quiet strength had already won admiration. Arthur stood at the table's edge, the sword that had chosen him resting by his side. "My friends," he began, his voice steady but low, "this circle was built to remind us that no man sits above another. Today, we must give it purpose. Let us become more than a court. Let us become a brotherhood of service." Merlin, standing near the far wall, watched silently as the king spoke. His expression held both pride and a kind of sadness, the gentle melancholy of one who already sees the ending written within the beginning. Arthur continued, "We will call ourselves not lords but knights. Our duty will be not to conquer, but to keep balance. Wherever injustice rises, we will stand against it. Wherever the weak cry out, we will answer. Not for glory, but for the peace that all men deserve." Bedwyr struck his fist to his chest. "Then let it be sworn. Let every hand at this table make the vow." One by one they rose. Each laid a hand upon the smooth wood, and in the hush of the hall, their voices joined. "We swear by the light of this kingdom and the land that bears it, to uphold honor without pride, to wield power without cruelty, to defend the innocent and to serve the peace of Britain until our last breath. Their voices faded, leaving only the crackle of torches and the faint hum of wind through the high arches. Merlin stepped forward then, his cloak whispering across the stone. "You have spoken well," he said softly. "But remember, a vow is a living thing. Feed it with truth, or it will die in silence." Arthur nodded. "Then let us feed it every day." From that moment, the Round Table became the living heart of Camelot. At dawn, knights gathered to hear petitions from the people, disputes over land, over law, over simple human need. Some came barefoot from distant villages, trembling before men they thought were legends. But they left comforted, for Arthur and his knights listened with care, never with judgment. The king often said, "A ruler's strength lies not in how he commands, but in how he listens." And so they listened. As weeks passed, the Round Table grew to hold 30, then 50 knights. Each came from a different part of Britain, some from the misty north, others from the green plains of the south. They spoke different tongues, carried different gods in their hearts, but around that circle they became one. In those early years, the land thrived. Trade routes reopened. Farmers sowed their fields without fear. Songs once sung only in mourning were now sung in celebration. Arthur would ride often through the countryside, not as a distant monarch, but as a man among his people. He helped mend fences, broke bread with shepherds, and carried water alongside those who had once called him boy instead of king. The children of Camelot followed his horse through the streets, calling his name with laughter. He would smile, though his gaze often turned distant, for he knew peace was as fragile as glass, easily cracked by ambition or despair. Merlin watched over it all, ever the quiet sentinel. To some he seemed ageless, to others weary. Yet he remained constant, offering counsel when asked, vanishing for days when not. The people whispered that he walked between worlds, half in the mortal realm, half in dream. One summer evening, the knights gathered for the first true feast of the Round Table. The hall glowed with candlelight, and music drifted through the open windows. Servants carried bread, roasted game, and honeyed mead, while laughter filled the space like sunlight in winter. Arthur raised his cup. "To Camelot," he said, "may it always be a light in dark times." "To Camelot," they echoed, the sound rolling through the hall like thunder. Yet amid the laughter, Merlin's gaze rested on one face, Lancelot's. The young knight sat quietly, his expression thoughtful, his eyes not on the king, but on the doorway where Guinevere stood. Newly arrived, radiant, her presence lighting the hall more than any flame. Merlin's lips pressed into a line. So it begins, he thought. The weeks that followed brought a gentle kind of joy to Camelot. Tournaments were held not for blood, but for sport. Minstrels sang of unity rather than war. The knights trained together each morning, their swords flashing in the sun, their laughter echoing off the walls. Among them, Lancelot shone brightest. His skill was unmatched, his manner gracious, his loyalty unquestioned. Even the older knights admired his calm precision, but it was his kindness, his habit of listening before speaking, of aiding the wounded and the poor, that made him beloved. Arthur took to calling him brother, and in time, even the people began to whisper that perhaps Lancelot was the truest knight in all the realm. Guinevere, now queen beside Arthur, watched him often. At first, only with admiration, the same admiration everyone felt. But admiration has a way of growing into something deeper when it is returned in silence. Merlin saw it long before either of them did. He said nothing. Some truths he knew must be allowed to unfold at their own pace, no matter how heavy they sit in the heart. One morning, as the knights gathered for council, a messenger arrived from the northern borders. Breathless, mud-splattered, eyes wide with fear. "The Saxons," he gasped. "They've begun to gather again, hundreds of them. They build forts near the coast. We fear they mean to test the peace." The hall fell silent. Arthur rose slowly. "Then we will not wait for war to find us," he said. "We will go to them, not with swords drawn, but with words first." The council agreed. It was decided that Arthur, Lancelot, Bedwyr, and a small company would ride north to parley. Merlin watched them prepare, his expression grave. When the king came to him before departure, he said only, "Remember, courage is not the absence of fear. It is the wisdom to act in spite of it." Arthur clasped his hand. "Then may wisdom ride with us." The journey took them through rolling moors and dark forests, where mist clung low and birds flew in uneasy silence. By the time they reached the Saxon outpost, the air was sharp with the scent of smoke. Arthur dismounted before the enemy's leader, a tall man with hair like flax and a scar across his cheek. "We come for peace," the king said in their tongue. "Not conquest. Britain has bled enough." The man studied him, eyes narrowing. "Peace," he repeated, as if testing the word. "Your people took my father's land." Arthur shook his head. "The land belongs to all who live by its laws and respect its peace. Stay, trade, build, but do not burn what we've built together." The Saxon hesitated, then lowered his weapon. "Perhaps your peace is worth trying, King of the Britons." Arthur smiled faintly. "Then let us begin again." And so, for a time, even the old enemies found reason to pause. When they returned to Camelot weeks later, the people greeted them with song. The round table gathered again, and the feast that night was brighter than any before. Yet beneath the joy, Merlin felt the subtle tremor, the faint crack beneath the surface of perfection. Love unspoken, ambition dormant, destiny waiting. He knew the day would come when even the strongest circle would break. But for now, Camelot glowed, and the laughter of its knights rang through the halls, pure, proud, and utterly unaware of how fragile such moments truly are. Outside, the moon rose full over the river, and the wind carried the echo of their voices far across the sleeping land. Voices swearing loyalty to a dream that would one day become legend. The days of Camelot passed in golden rhythm, steady, bright, and full of quiet grace. The walls gleamed white beneath the sun. Banners of crimson and blue rippled from the towers. Laughter echoed through the courtyards, mingled with the clatter of hooves and the scent of blooming lavender. It was the season when peace began to feel natural, when even the weary believed it might last forever. Yet peace, like spring, is a season that cannot stay. Beneath its warmth, the roots of longing began to stir. Guinevere had been queen for 3 years. Her beauty was not the kind sung by poets, but the kind that made silence feel softer. Her voice carried calm, her eyes carried light. She moved through the halls with kindness, stopping to speak with servants, to lift a child, to tend a wounded bird. Arthur loved her deeply. though his love was the kind shaped by duty and awe, steady as stone, gentle as rain. They shared trust and respect, and an unspoken understanding that their union was not only of hearts, but of the realm itself. But love, as Merlin often said, has many languages, and not all of them are spoken in words. Lancelot had become the greatest of Arthur's knights. His swordsmanship was unmatched, his manners flawless, his humility disarming. Wherever he rode, people cheered his name. The pure knight, they called him, the one closest to the king's heart. Yet it was not pride that burned within him, but something quieter, something more dangerous, the yearning to belong. He had crossed the sea from Armorica years before, seeking a purpose larger than himself, and he had found it here, in Camelot, in Arthur's vision of justice, in the circle of brotherhood, in the light that shone from the Queen's smile. At first, that smile was nothing more than warmth, the natural kindness of a woman who saw goodness in all. But warmth, when shared too often, can become flame. It happened slowly, a glance that lingered a heartbeat too long, a hand brushing another in the passing of a cup, words that meant nothing, yet somehow meant everything. Both knew the danger, both tried to turn away, but love is patient in its pursuit, and neither crown nor vow could silence it forever. One evening, the court gathered for a feast in the great hall. The air shimmered with the glow of torches, and music filled the space with lilting joy. Arthur sat at the centre of the round table, his laughter ringing out as knights told stories of distant quests and small victories. Lancelot sat near the end, his expression serene, his heart anything but. Across the table, Guinevere's gaze found his for the briefest moment. In that instant, the room seemed to fall away. The torches dimmed, the noise softened, and the world narrowed to the space between their eyes. Merlin saw it, of course. He always did. From the shadows near the doorway, he watched with quiet sorrow. He did not need magic to see where this path would lead. Later, when the hall had emptied and the fires burned low, he found Lancelot alone in the courtyard, polishing his armour under the pale moon. "You are troubled," Merlin said softly. Lancelot did not look up. "I am unworthy of the peace I've been given." The old man's eyes glimmered. "Peace is not a prize, Sir Lancelot. It is a choice, one that must be made again every day." Lancelot's hand stilled. "And if one's heart refuses that choice?" Merlin sighed. "Then you must teach it discipline, or it will teach you ruin." He left the knight to the silence, knowing his warning would be heard, but not heeded. As summer turned, the fields beyond Camelot burst into gold. Arthur spent many days away from the castle, riding with his men to settle border disputes, to oversee new harvests, to ensure that the peace of the realm held true. Guinevere remained behind, tending to the sick, the children, and the gardens that bloomed near the chapel. Lancelot, as ever, stayed close, appointed by the king as her protector during his absences. It was an honour he accepted with reverence and dread. At first, their time together was formal. They spoke of the welfare of the people, of Arthur's vision, of the progress of the knights. But in the quiet spaces between words, the unspoken grew louder. One evening, while walking the palace gardens, they paused by the fountain. The air smelled of mint and roses. The water caught the last light of day, turning silver as dusk deepened. Guinevere's voice broke the silence. Do you ever grow weary of being perfect, Sir Lancelot? He looked at her, startled by the question. Perfection is a myth, my lady. I am as flawed as any man. She smiled faintly. Yet you never show it. Perhaps, he said, his voice low. Because my flaws would wound more than they would free. Their eyes met. The air between them trembled. Guinevere turned away, her breath unsteady. You are loyal to my husband. And to you, he said simply. Those words hung in the air. Heavy, dangerous, true. Neither spoke again. The sound of the fountain filled the silence, steady and eternal. When they parted, neither slept that night. Days passed, and duty carried them forward. Arthur returned, bringing news of treaties and prosperity. The people rejoiced, the court sang. Yet, in the midst of celebration, a quiet ache lingered, a thread of longing woven into the tapestry of peace. Merlin noticed the subtle changes. The queen smiled less brightly. Lancelot rode less often with the knights, and Arthur, ever perceptive, sensed the distance without understanding its cause. One afternoon he found Merlin studying the river from the balcony. "You've been watching me again," Arthur said lightly. "I watch everything," Merlin replied. "That is the curse of those who see too much." Arthur smiled. "Then tell me what you see." The old man hesitated. "I see a kingdom at its height, and therefore nearest its fall." Arthur frowned. "You speak in riddles, as always." Merlin met his gaze. No wall, no law, no king can stand forever. The cracks begin not in stone, but in hearts. Arthur's expression softened. "Then I will keep those hearts strong." Merlin nodded, though in his eyes lingered the kind of sadness one feels for what cannot be prevented, only endured. Summer waned. The leaves turned amber and the air grew cool. The queen's garden faded into sleep, and the fires in the great hall burned earlier each day. One night, as rain drummed softly against the windows, Guinevere sat in her chamber alone. The room glowed with the light of a single candle. On her table lay a letter, simple, unsealed, written in a hand she knew too well. It was from Lancelot. A few words only. "My queen, my heart cannot hold its silence any longer. I would rather be exiled in truth than live near you in lies." Her hands trembled as she read it. Before dawn, she burned the letter. Yet the words remained, etched not on parchment, but in her soul. When she saw him next, they spoke of nothing. But everything had changed. Weeks later, during a hunt, Arthur was thrown from his horse in the forest. The fall left him wounded, unable to walk. Lancelot carried him back to Camelot in his arms. For days, the court waited in fear. Guinevere tended to the king's bedside, her eyes hollow with worry. When Arthur awoke, he smiled weakly. "You've both guarded me well," he whispered. "Two hearts I trust above all others." Neither could meet his gaze. Merlin stood in the doorway, his staff in hand. He said nothing, for nothing he might say could soften what was already set in motion. Time, as ever, moved on. Arthur healed, though a stiffness remained in his leg. Peace returned to the realm, at least on the surface, but beneath the calm, the current ran deep and unseen. Lancelot began to take longer patrols beyond the city, volunteering for distant quests. Guinevere withdrew to her chapel and her gardens, her smiles now quiet things. And Arthur, though he sensed the change, spoke of it to no one. He simply looked to the horizon more often, as though searching for something he had lost without knowing when. Merlin knew the truth. Love had come to Camelot, not the kind sung in joy, but the kind that tests the soul. It would not destroy them yet, but it had already begun to shape the ending that none of them could yet see. That night the moon hung high and pale over Camelot. The halls were silent, the fires low. Guinevere stood at her window, watching the river shimmer below. Somewhere beyond those walls, she knew, a knight kept watch, his heart bound by the same ache as hers. The wind carried the scent of rain and rosemary. In the distance, a single bell tolled midnight, and though the kingdom still slept in peace, the first shadow of sorrow had already crossed its dream. The years that followed were years of quiet beauty and slow decay, the kind one barely notices while living through it. Camelot still shone beneath the sun, its towers white and proud, its markets alive with laughter. Yet beneath the surface, the spirit that had once bound every heart began to drift like mist. Arthur felt it first, the subtle distance among his knights, the hesitations in their vows. Even the round table, once alive with laughter and brotherhood, seemed quieter now. It was then that the stories began. Travellers from the far west brought tales of a sacred relic, a cup, ancient and holy, said to have touched the lips of Christ himself. They called it the Grail, and spoke of it as both an object and a promise, of healing for the wounded, of redemption for the broken, of purity for the lost. At first, Arthur dismissed the tales as legend, but soon the whispers reached even the most faithful of his knights. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the hall's high windows, they gathered around the round table. The fire burned low, casting soft light across their faces. A young knight rose, Galahad, son of Lancelot, though the world had not yet known it. His eyes shone with unshakable purpose. "My king," he said, "the land is restless. The old wounds of Britain have not healed. Perhaps the Grail is meant to be found, to restore what we have lost." Arthur looked at him for a long moment. "Do you believe such a thing exists?" "I do," Galahad replied, "and if it does not, then faith itself will guide us toward it." Around the table murmurs stirred, hope, doubt, pride, fear. The hall seemed to breathe with them. Then Lancelot spoke quietly. "If the Grail is the measure of purity," he said, "then none of us will return unchanged." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning unseen by all but Merlin. That night, Arthur walked alone through the courtyard, his cloak drawn against the wind. He found Merlin standing beneath the rain, watching the torches shimmer. "They want to chase a shadow," Arthur said softly, "and I cannot stop them." Merlin's eyes were distant. "It is not your place to stop them. Every soul must seek its own truth, even when truth is costly." Arthur sighed. "And what will it cost me?" "Everything worth having," Merlin replied gently. By dawn, the decision was made. The knights would set forth to seek the Holy Grail. One by one, they pledged their vow to find the Cup of Light or die in the search. Arthur watched them ride out through the eastern gate, Lancelot at their head, Galahad beside him, Bedwyr and Kai close behind. The banners snapped in the wind, and the sound of hooves faded into the distance until all that remained was silence. Camelot felt emptier that day. Guinevere stood beside the king, her hands clasped tightly before her. "Will they find it?" she asked. Arthur's gaze lingered on the empty road. "If they do," he said, "it will be at great cost. Some quests are not meant to end, only to teach us who we are." Months passed, seasons turned, letters came rarely, and when they did, they carried strange tales, visions seen in forests, voices heard in dreams, wounds healed and hearts broken. Some knights returned, changed beyond recognition. Others did not return at all. Galahad was among those who vanished into legend. They said he had found the Grail, that he had seen a light so pure it blinded his mortal eyes, and that he was carried away, not dead, but gone beyond the reach of men. When Arthur heard this, he bowed his head in silence. Then he has seen what none of us were meant to see. Lancelot came home last. He rode alone, his armour tarnished, his eyes hollow. No one asked what he had found, for they could see the answer in his face. He knelt before the king, his voice barely a whisper. "I sought purity, my liege, but found only myself." Arthur placed a hand upon his shoulder. "Then perhaps that is all the Grail was ever meant to show." That winter, Camelot grew quieter still. The round table sat half empty, its surface worn smooth by years of hands now gone. The fires burned lower, and the laughter of old days faded into memory. Yet in that quiet, something gentle endured. A kind of wisdom born not from triumph, but from acceptance. Arthur often walked the halls alone at night. He would pause before the great windows, looking out across the fields, the river, the forests beyond. Once, these lands had been wild, torn by war. Now they lay still under the moonlight, whole at last. Not through conquest, but through care. Merlin found him there one evening, his face softened by the glow of the hearth. "Do you regret letting them go?" he asked. Arthur smiled faintly. "No. Every man must follow what he believes sacred. Even kings cannot command the soul." Merlin nodded. "Then you have learned the greatest truth of all." The king turned to him. "And what truth is that?" "That peace is not found by seeking perfection," Merlin said softly. "It is found by forgiving imperfection, in others and in ourselves." Arthur looked once more at the moonlit fields. "Then perhaps," he murmured, "the Grail was never lost. It has always been here." Outside, the wind whispered across the riverbanks, carrying the scent of earth and snow. Within the quiet walls of Camelot, the dream still lived, changed, weathered, but alive. And though many who sought the Grail were never seen again, their quest had left behind something finer than relics or glory, the memory of striving, the hope of redemption, and the soft, enduring belief that even in the broken heart of humankind, light could still be found. Winter melted into spring again, though Camelot seemed slower to wake than the land around it. The frost had left the fields. The birds had returned to the river banks. Yet within the castle walls there lingered a stillness that no warmth could break. The round table, once alive with the clatter of armour and laughter, now stood half empty. Many of its knights had not returned from the Grail quest. Their absence hung in the air like unspoken grief. Arthur sat often in the great hall, his hands folded on the worn oak, the sword of kingship resting beside him. He spoke less now, smiled less, though his eyes still carried the calm of a man who loved what he had built more than he feared what might come to break it. Those who came to counsel him noticed the change, a kind of distant sorrow. But it was Guinevere who felt it most. She watched her husband from across the long chamber as he read petitions and signed decrees. He looked older now, not from age, but from the weight of years spent carrying peace on shoulders made for battle. She longed to speak to him as she once had, to reach past the crown, the duty, the silence, but too much had passed between them. Their love had become a gentle friendship, a memory kept alive by habit and grace. And so, in the stillness that surrounded the king, another silence began to grow, one that would change everything. Lancelot had returned from the Grail quest a different man. The lightness that had once surrounded him, that quiet certainty of purpose, was gone. He moved through the castle as one half in shadow, speaking only when required, his laughter a sound remembered more than heard. Yet the people still loved him. They whispered his name as legend, and even the weary knights turned to him for counsel. Only Guinevere saw what others did not, the loneliness beneath his calm. It was inevitable, perhaps, that their paths would cross again. One afternoon, as a storm gathered beyond the western hills, she found him in the chapel, kneeling, unmoving, before the altar. "You pray often now," she said softly. He did not rise. "Prayers are all that remain for those who have failed." "You have not failed," she said. "You returned when others did not." He looked up then, and the pain in his eyes struck her like a blade. "I returned because I could not find what I sought. The Grail is for the pure, my lady, and I am not that." Guinevere stepped closer. "None of us are." Their words hung in the dim air, carrying a tenderness neither could deny. The storm outside broke, and rain beat softly against the stained glass. When at last Lancelot rose, he bowed his head low. "Forgive me," he whispered, and left the chapel. But forgiveness, like love, was not so simple. In the months that followed, the old ache returned. Quiet, constant, and impossible to name. The court saw only grace in their exchanges, the queen's smile when Lancelot entered the hall, the knight's devotion to her service. But whispers began to spread, soft at first, then sharper, more deliberate. Mordred, Arthur's nephew, was the first to give those whispers shape. He had long harboured envy of the king's strength, of the queen's grace, of Lancelot's honour. His words, murmured in corners and carried through corridors, grew like vines around stone. "They say the queen and her champion share more than loyalty," he told anyone who would listen. "They say the Round Table hides its greatest shame beneath its noblest oath." The poison worked slowly. Suspicion took root, and even those who did not believe began to wonder. One evening, Arthur called Lancelot to him. The fire burned low, its light soft and wavering. "Old friend," the king said quietly, "I've heard rumours, foolish, I hope, but troubling." Lancelot met his gaze. "You know my loyalty, sire." "I do," said Arthur. "I have always trusted you more than any man alive. Yet the people see shadows where none may exist. I cannot silence every tongue." Lancelot's hands tightened at his sides. "Then let me leave Camelot. Let me serve the realm elsewhere, where my name causes no harm." Arthur hesitated. If I lose you, I lose my right arm, and perhaps my heart as well." The two men stood in silence, bound by friendship and something deeper, a mutual grief for what both already knew but could not yet say. At last, Arthur nodded. "Go then, but go knowing this, whatever the world says, you will always have my faith." Lancelot bowed deeply. "And you, my king, will always have my life." When Guinevere learned he was leaving, she sought him out one final time. They met in the garden, beneath the apple trees, where the blossoms had begun to fall like snow. "So this is how it ends," she said. Lancelot shook his head. "No, this is how it must continue." Tears glimmered in her eyes. "And what of love?" He looked at her then, truly looked, as if memorizing every breath, every detail. "Love will survive us, as it always does. It will live in silence, where it began." She reached for his hand, but he stepped back. "If I touch you now," he said softly, "I will not leave." The wind stirred the blossoms around them, and for a moment the garden seemed to hold its breath. "Go then," she whispered, "and may God forgive us both." He bowed his head and turned away, the petals falling around him like the ashes of something holy. But fate, once set in motion, does not rest. Mordred saw their parting from the shadows and carried it to the court. He spoke with cunning and false devotion, twisting truth into treason. By the time Arthur returned from a distant council, the rumour had grown into accusation. "The Queen has betrayed you," Mordred said coldly, "and your beloved knight has betrayed your crown." Arthur's face went pale. "Be careful, nephew. Words like that can break a kingdom." "They already have," Mordred replied. The king's heart was torn between disbelief and duty. He summoned Guinevere, who came before him trembling but unbowed. "Is it true?" he asked, not as king, but as husband. Her answer came through tears. "I have loved you always, but I have also loved another." Arthur closed his eyes. The silence that followed was worse than anger. It was the sound of something sacred breaking. By dawn, the court was in uproar. Lancelot returned at word of the Queen's arrest, his face grim with resolve. He burst into the courtyard with a small band of loyal men, freeing her from the guards who held her. There was no battle cry, no triumph, only grief. He met Arthur's gaze across the chaos. Neither spoke. Then Lancelot and Guinevere fled into the night. Mordred's voice rose through the confusion. "Treason! The Queen and her lover defy the crown!" And in that single shout, Camelot's peace shattered. For days the castle stood in shock. The people wept, the knights argued, and the round table, once whole, fractured beyond repair. Merlin walked the empty hall in silence, his hand resting on the table's smooth surface. "So ends the age of innocence," he murmured. Arthur sat in his chamber, the sword of kingship beside him, its once bright edge dulled by candlelight. He spoke softly, as if to himself. "I built this kingdom on trust, and it is trust that undoes it." Merlin, standing by the window, said only, "Nothing built by love is ever truly lost. Even broken dreams leave roots that may bloom again." But Arthur did not answer. He was listening to the wind outside. carrying the echo of hooves vanishing into the distance, and with them, the last perfect light of Camelot. After the flight of Lancelot and Guinevere, Camelot fell into a long, uneasy quiet. The air that once carried the sound of laughter and song now held only whispers, faint, fearful, uncertain. Arthur walked the corridors like a man half asleep, haunted not by enemies, but by memories. He had built his kingdom on unity, and now, in its broken silence, he could hear the slow unravelling of everything he loved. The Round Table still stood, but its circle no longer held. Knights who once swore brotherhood now eyed each other with suspicion. Some blamed the Queen, others blamed Lancelot. But in truth, none could say where the fault began, or where it might end. Only Merlin knew. "Division," he said quietly, "is not born in betrayal. It is born in pride and fed by fear." Arthur listened, but his heart was weary. "Then I have fed it well," he whispered. It was during those fractured months that Mordred stepped forward. He was young still, barely more than a man, though his eyes carried the sharpness of one who had waited too long to be noticed. To the court he was Arthur's nephew, the son of Arthur's half-sister Morgause, and by some dark whisper perhaps of Arthur himself. The truth of his birth had long been clouded by rumour, and Arthur, perhaps out of guilt, had never spoken to deny it. That silence had given Mordred what he desired most, the seed of possibility. He was charming when he wished to be, eloquent, clever. He moved among the wounded hearts of Camelot like a physician of discontent, offering comfort to the bitter, purpose to the lost. To those weary of the king's sorrow, he promised renewal. To those still loyal, he spoke softly of loyalty's limits. Why should one man's grief silence the future of Britain? He would ask. The king is kind, but kindness alone will not defend us forever. His words spread through the halls like smoke, invisible at first, then inescapable. Arthur tried to hold the kingdom steady. He ordered the borders strengthened, the villages supplied, the markets reopened. But his presence had changed. The fire that once lit his speech was dimmed, and the people began to look elsewhere for direction. And everywhere they turned, they found Mordred, poised, confident, smiling. Merlin watched him with quiet dread. One night, as the two men stood overlooking the sleeping city, the old seer spoke softly. "You've made him your heir, haven't you?" Arthur's shoulders tensed. "Britain needs stability. The people trust him. He carries my blood." Merlin's voice was calm, but heavy with warning. "Blood is not the measure of a man, Arthur. Be careful what legacy you invite into your throne." The king turned toward the dark horizon. "If he is my sin," he said quietly, "then let him be my penance." In the months that followed, Mordred grew bolder. He took command of the council in the king's absences, speaking with authority that was not yet his. He rode through the streets surrounded by guards, accepting the cheers of the crowd as though they were his by right. When Arthur was away settling disputes along the western coast, Mordred sat upon the high seat in the great hall, not as regent, but as ruler. He signed decrees in the king's name. He ordered taxes lifted, debts forgiven. He smiled as the people blessed him. To them, he was youth, vigour, promise, a new dawn for a tired kingdom. To Merlin, he was the shadow that comes when light grows too bright. Then came the letter. It arrived by secret hand, carried through storm and silence. Word that Lancelot and Guinevere had been found, living in peace beyond the sea. Arthur read it in his chamber, his hands trembling, his heart torn between love and shame. When Mordred learned of it, he saw his moment. He gathered the knights still loyal to him and stood before the court. "The king has gone to war for love," he declared. "He rides to punish those who wronged him, while Britain lies unguarded." His voice rang through the hall, steady and cold. "Who protects us now? Who defends the throne? Should we not have a king who stays with his people?" By morning, the gates of Camelot were sealed, not by enemies, but by its own men. Mordred declared himself protector of the realm, and though few dared speak it aloud, all knew what that meant. When word reached Arthur, he was camped near the coast, his men weary from travel. He read the message twice before speaking. So the son rises before the father. Merlin stood beside him, silent for a long time. Then he said, "This was always coming. You knew it." Arthur nodded. "A king cannot escape his own mistakes. He can only meet them." He turned to his men. "We march for Camelot." The march north was long and bitter. Rain fell without pause, soaking armour and spirit alike. At every village, Arthur saw the toll of his absence. Fields untended, faces uncertain, loyalties divided. He rode among them not as the shining figure of legend, but as a weary man seeking to put right what he had let slip away. Some bowed to him still, others turned their eyes. When at last he reached the plains before Camelot, the city stood walled and waiting, his banners replaced by Mordred's. The young man rode out to meet him under a sky streaked with crimson light. They faced one another in silence, two figures mirrored by blood and fate. "You should not have returned," Mordred said. "And you should never have stayed," Arthur replied. The wind stirred between them, carrying the sound of distant thunder. "This need not end in blood," said the king. "Lay down your claim, and I will forgive what can be forgiven." Mordred's mouth curved into a smile that was both sad and cruel. "Forgive me, father, but I have already forgiven you." He turned his horse and rode back toward the gates. Behind him, the first arrows rose. That night, as campfires flickered beneath the storm, Arthur sat beside Merlin one last time. The old man's eyes glimmered with sorrow. "The circle is closing." Arthur nodded. "It began with unity. It will end with division. Yet still, I would not trade a moment of it." Merlin placed a hand on his shoulder. "When morning comes, you will face your fate. But remember, Arthur, even endings are only beginnings written in another tongue." The king smiled faintly. "Then let the dawn write what it must." And so, beneath the dark sky of Britain, father and son prepared to meet, not as family, but as reflections of a kingdom at war with itself. The river mist rose around their camps like ghostly breath, and somewhere in the distance, an owl cried through the night. A sound both mournful and eternal, as if the land itself already knew the cost of what was coming. The dawn came heavy and grey. Clouds pressed low over the valley of Camlann, and the air carried that strange, waiting stillness that always comes before great storms, when even the birds seem to hold their breath. Arthur stood on the ridge above the river, his cloak dark with rain. Below him, his army gathered. the remnants of a kingdom once united by love and faith. Farmers, knights, and weary soldiers formed ranks in the wet grass, their banners sagging beneath the mist. Across the plain on the opposite hill, another army waited. Mordred's. Father and son, king and heir, light and shadow. The two halves of Britain staring at one another through the veil of mourning. Merlin stood beside Arthur, silent, his face carved with sorrow. "This will be the last," Arthur said quietly. Merlin nodded. "One way or another." They stood without speaking for a long while. The only sound was the wind moving through the heather, whispering over the field where the dream of Camelot would soon come to rest. Before the battle began, Arthur called his captains close. The men knelt in a circle, their armour glinting faintly in the dim light. "My friends," he said, "we fight not for revenge, nor for glory. We fight to keep the promise we made, that peace would live in this land, even when we do not. If we fall, let the people remember us not as conquerors, but as guardians of a dream." Bedwyr bowed his head. "We will hold true, my king." Arthur smiled faintly. "No, hold true for yourselves, not for me. For one day, there will be no Arthur to follow, only the memory of what we tried to be." He looked around the circle, his gaze resting last on the old wizard. "And you, my friend, you have guided me through every shadow. What would you have me do now?" Merlin's eyes shimmered with rain and grief. "Fight, if you must. But remember, your sword is not your legacy. Your mercy is." Arthur nodded. "Then may I wield both with equal care." When the sun finally rose, it was pale and bloodless. Mordred's army advanced first, a dark tide of spears and shields moving through the mist. The two forces met in the narrow valley where the river bent like a blade. The clash was sudden, deafening. Iron struck iron. The ground turned to mud beneath the weight of men and horses. The cries of battle mingled with the storm that broke overhead, lightning flashing against the steel. Arthur rode at the front, his banner of the golden dragon streaming behind him. The sword in his hand, the same that had once waited in the stone, cut through the chaos like a beam of light. Yet for every enemy that fell, two more rose to take his place. He fought not as a man seeking victory, but as one holding back the tide, buying time for something he could no longer name. Across the field, Mordred rode through the storm like a reflection of his father. His armour blackened, his blade bright. The resemblance was haunting. Where Arthur's gaze held compassion, Mordred's burned with cold fire. They saw each other through the rain, and in that instant, both knew what was coming. By midday, the battle had turned the valley into ruin. The river ran red, its current thick with rain and blood. The cries of the wounded carried across the hills, echoing like distant thunder. Arthur's men held fast, but they were fewer now. Every charge met with equal fury. Still, he pressed on, his heart heavy, his purpose clear. When he found Mordred again, it was near the edge of the river, where the earth had given way into marsh. They faced one another through the smoke and rain. "This is not the way," Arthur called, his voice breaking through the storm. "Lay down your sword. End this." Mordred's eyes narrowed. "End it? You ended it the day you built a dream you could not keep. You called it peace, but it was always your pride." Arthur shook his head. "No dream survives without struggle." "Then let this be the end of dreams," Mordred said, and spurred his horse forward. Their blades met with a sound that cut through the roar of battle. Steel against steel, father against son. They fought like men who understood that one could not live while the other stood. Each strike carried both fury and sorrow. Arthur's strength was fading, but his resolve burned fierce. Mordred moved like a storm, relentless, desperate, driven by the need to be seen. At last, Arthur's sword found its mark. The young man fell, the light dimming in his eyes. But even as he fell, Mordred thrust forward, his blade piercing the king's side. For a moment, both men were still. The storm roaring around them, the river rising, the air thick with grief. Mordred's voice trembled. "Father!" Arthur caught him as he sank. "Peace, my son. You were always mine, whether you wished it or not." Then the boy was gone. When the battle ended, there was no cheer of victory, only silence. The field lay strewn with the fallen, the dream of Camelot broken upon its own heart. The rain softened the ground, washing away the lines that once divided friend from foe. Arthur's men found him near the riverbank, still upright, his sword buried in the mud beside him. His breath came slow, each one a struggle. Bedwyr knelt at his side, tears streaking his face. "My king, we've won. Mordred is dead. The field is ours." Arthur's eyes fluttered open. "No, Bedwyr, no field is ever ours. The land belongs to those who care for it. And I have cared as best I could." Merlin approached then, kneeling beside the king. The old man's cloak was soaked, his face pale. "You have done enough," he said softly. Arthur looked up at him, faintly smiling. "Have I? Or have I only delayed what must come?" "Peace will come," Merlin whispered, "in time." Arthur nodded weakly. Then, "There is hope." Merlin took his hand. "Always." The king's gaze drifted toward the river, where the mists were rising again. "Then take me to the water," he murmured. "There is one last duty yet." They carried him through the quiet aftermath, the sound of rain their only song. The surviving knights followed, silent, bowed beneath the weight of their grief. When they reached the river's edge, Arthur motioned to Bedwyr. "Take my sword," he said. "Return it to the lake from which it came." Bedwyr hesitated. "No, my king, it is your legacy." Arthur's voice was firm, though faint. "My legacy is not in steel, but in the hearts of men. Do as I ask." The knight took the blade and walked to the water's edge. Twice he tried to throw it, and twice he could not. The thought of parting with it felt like letting go of the sun itself. When he returned, Arthur asked, "What did you see?" "Nothing," Bedwyr said. "Only ripples." "Then you did not do as I asked," said the king gently. "Go again." This time, Bedwyr lifted the sword high and flung it far into the deep. As it spun through the air, the clouds parted, and from the misted waters rose a pale arm, clothed in white, catching the blade and drawing it slowly beneath the surface. Bedwyr fell to his knees. When he turned back, Arthur's eyes were closed, his breath shallow. "It is finished," the king whispered. Merlin knelt beside him. "No, Arthur, it is begun." The rain eased. The wind softened. The mists gathered thick around the riverbank, wrapping them in silence. And in that silence, the dream that was Camelot, born of faith, tested by love, broken by pride, began to drift toward its end. Far above the valley, the storm clouds thinned, and for a brief moment, sunlight broke through. It touched the land gently, as if blessing what had been lost and what might one day rise again. The valley lay silent before dawn, the air heavy with mist. It was a silence not of peace, but of waiting, the kind that seems to hold the breath of the world. No birds sang, no wind stirred the grass. Only the river moved, slow and dark, whispering along its banks like the voice of time itself. Arthur stood upon the ridge, cloaked in grey. Behind him, his army waited, weary men who had fought too many wars and buried too many brothers. They knew this day would be their last. The king's armour was dulled by years of use, scratched and worn, the gleam of glory long replaced by the sheen of endurance. He turned his gaze towards the horizon, where the first faint line of light was breaking. Across the plain, on the far slope of Camlann, the banners of Mordred's host rose black against the dawn. For a moment, Arthur felt no anger, only sorrow, for the son he must destroy, and for the dream they had both shattered. Merlin approached quietly, his staff tapping lightly against the wet earth. He had aged beyond measure, the fire in his eyes dimmed, though not gone. When he spoke, his voice carried the calm of a man who has seen the pattern of fate and learned that no plea can unweave it. "The hour has come," he said softly. Arthur nodded. "So it has." Merlin looked out across the misted field. "If you go down there, you will not return." Arthur smiled faintly. "Then at least I will go as I have lived, fighting for what I love." The old wizard sighed. "You have always loved too deeply. That is your greatness and your ruin." Arthur's hand rested on the hilt of his sword, the same blade that once marked the dawn of a kingdom. Better to love too deeply than to live without it. Merlin bowed his head. "Then may the gods remember your mercy." As the sun climbed higher, the mists began to thin. The plain shimmered with dew, the grass glistening like a field of silver spears. Both armies stirred, the clink of armour breaking the stillness. Arthur mounted his horse, a grey stallion named Simrin, old as its rider, steady beneath the weight of fate. He rode slowly down the slope, the sound of his men following like a single heartbeat. Across the valley, Mordred's army advanced. 2 rivers of men, born of the same land, now flowing toward one another for the last time. Arthur raised his sword high, the morning light catching on its edge. No horn sounded, no drumbeat marked the beginning. The Battle of Camlann began with a single shout, then 1,000, and the world was swallowed by noise. The first clash was thunderous. Spears shattered, shields splintered, the air filled with cries and the ringing of steel. Arthur's horse plunged through the chaos, his sword striking with measured grace, not rage, but necessity. He moved like a man cutting through the fabric of destiny itself, every motion deliberate, every strike an act of farewell. Mordred's men fought with the ferocity of desperation, driven by youth, by ambition, by the belief that they could seize the future through force. Arthur's men fought with something deeper, the quiet strength of those who know they are the last of something good. Through the smoke and rain, the 2 armies blended into one writhing mass. Brother against brother, father against son, all distinctions lost in the madness of grief. From the hill above, Merlin watched, his staff clutched tight, his face turned to the sky. He whispered words older than any prayer, not to change fate, but to ease it. The storm clouds thickened and lightning split the air. Rain began to fall, slow at first, then steady, then endless, and still they fought. By midday, the ground had turned to mud, slick and red. Horses stumbled, men sank to their knees. The river swelled with rain and blood, its waters running swift and dark. The valley became a mirror of sorrow, no longer a place of battle, but a grave for all that Britain had been. Arthur found Mordred near the centre of the field. The boy, the man, stood tall amidst the ruin, his armour dented, his face streaked with rain and blood. He looked so much like the king had in his youth that for a moment Arthur's heart faltered. "Mordred," he called, "this need not end in death. There is still mercy to be found." Mordred's voice carried through the storm. "You speak of mercy as though it could undo what you've done. You built a dream that left no place for me." Arthur rode closer, lowering his sword. "You were always my blood. You were meant to inherit what I built, not destroy it." Mordred's eyes gleamed with fury and grief. "Then you should have claimed me. You should have spoken my name with pride, not shame." Arthur's face tightened. "You do not understand. I kept silent to protect you. From prophecy, from hatred, from myself." Mordred's answer was a cry of rage. "You protected only your crown." And with that, he charged. The two met in the centre of the field, where the rain fell hardest. Their swords struck like thunder, sparks flying through the storm. Each knew the other's strength, each understood the other's heart. And so each blow was perfectly matched, perfectly mournful. Arthur's arm grew heavy. The wound in his side from an earlier skirmish burned with every movement. Mordred pressed forward, relentless. "End it!" the young man shouted. "Show me the mercy you denied your kingdom!" Arthur deflected one final strike, then drove his sword upward. The blade pierced Mordred's armour, driving deep. For a heartbeat, the world was still. Rain fell softly between them, hissing on steel. Mordred gasped, eyes wide, and in that moment the fury drained from him, leaving only sorrow. "I only ever wanted to be your son," he whispered. Arthur caught him as he fell. "And you were," he said. "You were always mine." Mordred's head rested against his shoulder, and with a final breath, he was gone. Arthur sank to his knees beside him. The rain washed over them both. He felt the strength leaving his limbs, the weight of the sword growing heavier than stone. Around him, the sounds of battle faded, not because the fighting had ended, but because his hearing had grown distant, muffled, as though the world were pulling away. In that haze, he saw the valley through new eyes, not as a field of death, but as a place of returning. The land itself, it seemed, was taking back what man had borrowed: courage, pride, and the fragile hope of peace. He whispered, "So ends the age of kings." Then the ground swayed beneath him, and the sky dimmed. When his men found him, he was still kneeling beside Mordred, the sword buried in the earth. His eyes were open, though unfocused, watching something far beyond the rain. They lifted him gently. Bedwyr, faithful until the end, pressed a hand to his shoulder. "My king," The battle is over. Arthur's lips curved faintly. No battle is ever over, Bedwyr. It only changes its name. They carried him from the field toward the riverbank, where Merlin waited. The old wizard's eyes were wet with more than rain. "The dream has fallen," Arthur murmured. Merlin shook his head. "Dreams do not die. They sleep and are born again." Arthur closed his eyes. "Then let this one sleep long, until Britain is ready to remember." Merlin took his hand, whispering words no one else could hear. The rain slowed. The clouds began to part. And for one fleeting moment, light touched the broken valley, gilding the fallen banners, the scattered armour, the sword that had once united them all. It was not the light of victory, but of remembrance, the kind that lingers long after sound and sorrow fade. As evening fell, the river carried the first stars upon its surface. The last of Arthur's men built no monument, raised no cry. They simply stood in silence, knowing they had witnessed the passing of more than a king. They had seen the ending of an age and the beginning of legend. And in the hush of twilight, as the wind drifted through the hills, some swore they heard a voice, soft, steady, eternal, once and future, a promise carried on the breath of the dying storm. The rain had ceased, but the mist still clung to the valley. It hung low over the river, veiling the scars of the battlefield as though the earth itself wished to forget. Broken spears jutted from the mud like reeds. Armour lay scattered among the wildflowers, already bending back toward the soil. In the stillness, the king lay breathing softly. Arthur's cloak was soaked through, his blood mingling with the rainwater that streamed past him toward the river's edge. The storm had passed, but within his body the tempest had not yet stilled. Merlin knelt beside him, his cloak heavy with water. Bedwyr, the last of the faithful knights, stood nearby, his sword lowered, his face drawn with exhaustion and grief. "Is he dying?" Bedwyr whispered. Merlin looked down, his old hands trembling as he pressed them against Arthur's chest. "Not dying," he said. "Passing." Bedwyr frowned through his tears. "There is a difference." The old man's eyes softened. To die is to end. To pass is to begin again. The king stirred, his voice barely more than breath. "Is it over?" Merlin bent close. "The battle is done, my lord." Arthur's gaze drifted toward the dim sky, where the clouds were breaking. "Then so is the dream." "No," said Merlin gently. "Dreams do not end with those who dream them. They scatter like seeds, waiting for the next spring." Arthur smiled faintly. "You speak as though hope were a season." "Hope is the only season that never truly dies," said the wizard. The king tried to rise, but pain gripped his side, forcing him back. His breath came shallow, ragged. "Help me to the river," he murmured. "I would see it once more." They lifted him carefully, wrapping his cloak around his shoulders. Bedwyr carried his shield. Merlin steadied his steps. The air was cool and quiet. No sound came from the field now, only the murmur of water and the low rustling of wind through reeds. When they reached the bank, Arthur stopped. Before them, the river spread wide and slow, its surface glinting like a sheet of dim silver beneath the fading sun. The mists rose from it like breath from sleeping lungs. "This is where it ends," the king said softly. Merlin nodded. "Or where it begins." Arthur smiled weakly. "Always the same riddle. Always the same truth," said Merlin. For a time, they stood in silence. The smell of wet earth filled the air. A heron lifted from the reeds, its wings slicing through the mist. Arthur closed his eyes and listened, to the soft lap of the current, to the faint hum of the land. "Do you hear it?" he asked. "Hear what, my king?" said Bedwyr. "The island," Arthur whispered, "the heart of Britain. It calls to me." Merlin's eyes glistened. "Then we must take you to it." He turned to Bedwyr. "Go down to the shore. There will be a barge waiting." The knight hesitated. "A barge? There is nothing here but water and fog." "Go," said Merlin. "Trust what you cannot yet see." Bedwyr obeyed, stepping through the reeds to the edge of the water. For a moment, all was still. Then, from the mist, something moved, soft, silent, gliding. A small boat emerged from the fog, its hull black and gleaming, its prow carved in the shape of a dragon's head. Upon it stood 3 women cloaked in white, their faces calm, their eyes filled with a light that was not of this world. Bedwyr stepped back, awe striking him silent. Merlin and Arthur descended the bank slowly. The water lapped at their boots, cold and clear. The tallest of the women spoke. Her voice was like a whisper through leaves. "We have come for the king." Arthur looked up at her, unafraid. "And where will you take me?" "To the place of rest," she said, "until the world has need of you again." Merlin helped him into the barge. Bedwyr followed, setting down the king's sword at his feet. Its hilt gleamed faintly, the last light of the setting sun caught in the gold. Arthur leaned against the side of the vessel, his breathing shallow, his face peaceful. "Bedwyr," he said softly, "you have served me all your life. There is one last task I ask of you." The knight knelt beside him. "Anything, my king." "When the people ask where I have gone," Arthur said, "tell them not that I am dead, but that I sleep. Tell them Britain's heart still beats beneath the water, waiting." Tears filled Bedwyr's eyes. "They will never forget you." Arthur smiled faintly. "No, but they will remember something better. The dream." The women pushed the barge from the shore. It drifted slowly into the current, the mist curling around it like a shroud. Bedwyr stood in the shallows, watching as the river carried his king away. "Will he live?" he asked through the rising fog. Merlin's voice came softly beside him. "He will rest in Avalon." "Avalon." "The isle beyond time," said the old man, "where the wounded are healed and kings become legends." The knight bowed his head. "Will he return?" Merlin's eyes followed the vanishing shape of the barge. "All legends return, but not while the world still remembers them." On the river, the mist grew thicker. The barge glided without sound, its oars untouched, as if the current itself carried it forward. The 3 women stood like statues, their pale faces serene. Arthur lay with his eyes half closed, his breath slowing, his body light as driftwood upon the tide. The pain had faded, the weight of years, the crown, the wars, the heartbreak, all of it lifted. He thought of Guinevere's laughter in the garden, of Lancelot's loyalty and sorrow, of the round table shining with candlelight and hope. He thought of the boy he once was, pulling a sword from a stone beneath a sky filled with promise. And he smiled. "Merlin," he whispered, though the old man was far behind now. "I understand." In the dimness, one of the women leaned close, her voice soft as the river's sigh. "Sleep now, Arthur. Your work is done." As the boat slipped deeper into the mist, the world grew quieter. The sky dimmed to silver, then to dusk. The king's hand, resting on the sword's hilt, loosened. His fingers fell still. The last of his breath escaped as a sigh. Gentle, content, complete. The river caught it and carried it onward, scattering it into the fog like a blessing. The barge drifted on, vanishing slowly into the grey horizon, until nothing remained but the ripples of its passing and the faint scent of wild thyme in the air. Back on the shore, Bedwyr fell to his knees. "He is gone," he said. Merlin placed a hand upon his shoulder. "No, he is home." They stood there together, watching the last of the light fade over the water. The wind had stilled. The valley lay in perfect calm. "Do you think they will remember?" Bedwyr asked quietly. Merlin smiled faintly. "They will remember him as they need to. Some will call him king, others savior. But in truth, he was simply a man who dreamed of peace and dared to believe it might last." The knight nodded, his tears falling freely now. "Then may the dream never die." Merlin looked to the horizon one final time. "It won't. Not while the land remembers his name." He turned, his cloak sweeping the wet earth. "Come, Bedwyr. The age of men must begin." And so, under the quiet veil of twilight, the last of the old magic faded from Britain. The king slept beneath the mists of Avalon. The river flowed on, steady and eternal, whispering the song of a promise not yet broken. And those centuries would pass, and kingdoms rise and fall. The story of Arthur, the boy from the ruins of Rome, the king who forged a dream from the ashes of war, would never be forgotten. For some said that on still nights, when the fog drifts low and the water glimmers silver beneath the moon, a soft voice can still be heard across the river. "I will come again when Britain has need." The mists of Avalon drifted low upon the water, pale as breath, soft as silk. The river wound through the valley like a memory of something holy, its surface smooth and silver beneath the waning moon. Somewhere beyond sight, the faint outline of a barge glided through the fog, carrying its burden toward the place where legend meets eternity. Those who watched from the shore spoke of it only in whispers. They said the king had not died, only crossed over, to a realm untouched by time or grief, but none could say for certain what lay beyond the veil. Only one figure remained by the water's edge, long after the others had gone. Merlin. The old wizard stood alone, his staff buried in the soft mud, his eyes fixed upon the rippling current. The wind stirred his cloak, carrying the scent of earth and rain, and something faintly sweet, the fragrance of wild lilies that grew along the bank. He whispered, "Guard him well." His words vanished into the mist, carried away by the slow rhythm of the river. The mists began to shift, parting just enough to reveal the faint glimmer of an island far across the water. It was small, a rise of emerald grass ringed with willows, whose long branches trailed the surface like fingers. At its heart stood a solitary figure, cloaked in white. She waited. Her face was serene, her eyes ancient. Around her, the air shimmered faintly, as though light itself obeyed her quiet presence. This was the Lady of the Lake, the keeper of the sword, the guardian of the passage between mortal and myth. When the barge approached, she raised her hand. The mist obeyed, curling aside to clear the way. The boat drifted gently to shore, its oars unmoving, its motion guided by unseen will. The women who had steered it stepped back, bowing low before her. "The king has come," said one. The lady nodded, her expression calm. "As all things must return to the water." She stepped forward, her bare feet leaving no mark upon the damp grass. Kneeling beside the sleeping form of Arthur, she placed a hand upon his brow. "Peace," she whispered. "The burdens of the world are behind you." Her touch was neither warm nor cold. It was the stillness of the lake itself, the calm that comes after the last ripple fades. The sword lay beside him, its hilt still gleaming faintly even in death. She reached for it, lifting it with reverence. The metal sang softly as it left his grasp, a sound like a sigh, the final breath of the age of kings. The lady turned toward the lake. The water parted gently before her, forming a path of light that stretched into its depths. She walked until the water reached her waist, her white cloak floating like cloud around her. Then, with a motion both solemn and tender, she lowered the sword beneath the surface. The lake received it as though it had been waiting all along. Ripples spread outward, glowing faintly before dissolving into the stillness. From the shore, the barge waited in silence. The air was heavy with the scent of rain and lilies. The women who had brought Arthur began to sing, a song in a language older than the hills, older even than the name of Britain itself. Their voices rose and fell like the tide, a melody both sorrowful and sweet. It spoke of endings that are beginnings, of sleep that is not loss, but renewal. The lady turned back toward the island. The mist coiled around her, soft and luminous, wrapping the world in quiet. When she reached the king again, she looked down at him long and steadily. "You carried the hopes of men," she said softly, "and bore them well. Now rest. Let the land heal. Let time remember you gently." As she spoke, the air shimmered. The barge and its passengers faded slowly into the mist, until only the lady remained, her hand resting lightly on Arthur's still heart. Then even she was gone. The lake was once more whole. In the years that followed, the people of Britain spoke of strange lights seen at night over the water, soft, blue flames that drifted just above the surface before vanishing. Some said they were the spirits of Arthur's knights, keeping vigil still. Others said it was the lady herself, rising to watch over the kingdom from afar. Whatever the truth, the lake became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Travellers would leave offerings along its shore, a sprig of holly, a piece of silver, a small stone marked with a cross. They came not seeking miracles, but remembrance, to stand in the place where hope had once taken breath. Far to the east, Merlin wandered the forests alone. He no longer carried his staff. The power that had once shaped destinies had grown quiet within him. The people still whispered his name, but to him, such words were as meaningless as wind. He walked until the trees grew thick and the noise of the world faded. There, he built himself a small shelter of moss and stone beside a spring that ran cold and clear. Each morning he listened to the birds. Each night he looked to the stars. And though he had not seen the lady since that day on the river, he often thought of her, not as a goddess or spirit, but as the last echo of a time when the world was full of wonder. Sometimes in the hours before dawn, when the fog rose low and silver across the ground, he would swear he heard her voice. It would whisper through the leaves, soft and distant. All things return. Seasons passed, villages grew and faded. Children who had once seen the king's banner grew old and told their grandchildren stories of a golden age, of Camelot, of knights who rode for honour, of a queen whose tears had watered the roots of forgiveness. The tales changed as tales do. Some said Arthur had been taken by angels. Others claimed he slept beneath the hill, his sword across his knees, waiting for the call of the horn that would awaken him when Britain's need was greatest. And always the lady remained, silent, unseen, eternal. One winter night, when frost rimed the edges of the lake, a shepherd passing by saw something that made him fall to his knees. In the centre of the water, a figure stood, cloaked in silver light, her reflection shimmering across the frozen surface. He watched as she raised her hand toward the sky. From the depths beneath her, a faint glow rose, soft, like moonlight trapped in glass. It was the sword. For an instant, it broke the surface, bright, whole, shining, before sinking again into the deep. The shepherd fled, breathless, whispering prayers as he ran. But in the morning, when he returned with others, the lake was still. Only the frost remained, glistening like the memory of something divine. Time moved on. Empires came and went. Wars raged and cooled. And the old stories faded into legend. Yet the lake remained unchanged. In spring, wildflowers bloomed along its banks. In autumn, the mists returned thicker than ever, curling like threads of silk across the water's face. Those who lingered near it often felt an inexplicable calm, a stillness that seemed to reach into the heart. Some said it was the lady's blessing. Others said it was the king's dream, still sleeping beneath the surface, waiting for the world to be worthy of its awakening. And perhaps they were both right, for deep beneath the water, where light grows thin and sound is only memory, there lies a place untouched by decay. There, upon a bed of moss and stone, rests a figure cloaked in shadow and gold. His face is peaceful, his hands folded across his chest. Beside him lies the sword, its edge dulled, its purpose fulfilled, but its light undimmed. Around him, the water hums with the faint echo of distant bells, the heartbeat of a world that once believed. The lady watches still. She keeps her vigil not out of duty, but of love, for the dream that once walked the earth, for the man who bore it, for the hope that someday, somewhere, someone will remember. And so the lake remains, calm, patient, timeless. On quiet nights, when the moon hangs low and the air smells of rain, its surface gleams with a faint shimmer, as if the stars themselves lean down to touch it. Listen closely, and you might hear the whisper of ripples, not from wind, but from a hand that stirs the water, testing its reflection. A voice, soft as the tide, drifts across the stillness. Sleep, dear king. The world is not yet ready, but one day it will call, and you will rise. The sound fades, the water stills, and the mists close once more over the lady and her lake, guarding, waiting as they have since the world was young. There are places in the world where the veil between things grows thin, where the earth hums faintly beneath one's feet, and the air itself seems to remember. Avalon is such a place. It lies beyond the maps of men, beyond the tides that mark the edge of Britain's known world. No compass points toward it. No wind carries ships to its shore unless the island itself allows. It is not hidden, only unseen, wrapped in a mist so deep that those who wander near might feel its breath upon their skin and still never find it. And yet, for those the island calls, Avalon is as real as dawn. When the barge bearing Arthur crossed into the fog, the world of men began to fade. The rain ceased. The sound of the river fell away, replaced by a deep, rhythmic pulse, like the slow beating of a heart. Light shimmered through the mist, neither sun nor moon, but something older, a glow that seemed to come from within the air itself. The king stirred, though his body was weak. "Where are we?" he whispered. The lady of the lake stood beside him, her hand resting gently upon the edge of the barge. "We are between," she said, "between time and its forgetting." Arthur's eyes, though heavy, still searched the shifting horizon. "It is beautiful," she smiled faintly. "It is what beauty becomes when freed from sorrow." The mist parted slowly, revealing a landscape like a dream made solid. Rolling meadows of emerald grass stretched toward hills veiled in silver haze. The air carried the scent of apple blossom and salt. Birds sang softly in unseen trees, their notes slow and pure, as if each sound were weighed with care. At the island's centre rose a hill crowned by a circle of standing stones, ancient beyond reckoning. Between those stones shimmered a light, steady, eternal. The barge drifted to the shore and came to rest upon smooth white sand. The lady helped Arthur to his feet. Though his body trembled, his pain was gone. The wounds from battle had closed. The weight of years had lifted. He looked down at his hands, the lines of age fading as he watched. "What is this place?" "It is the heart of the world," said the lady softly, "where all things return to rest and to remember what they are." They walked together up the hill. The air was warm but not heavy, filled with the soft hum of unseen life. The grass beneath their feet shimmered faintly, each blade bending as if in reverence. At the summit stood a great tree, vast, silver-barked, its roots twisting deep into the earth and its branches reaching into the clouds. From its limbs hung small lights like lanterns, each one pulsing gently with colour. Blues, golds, soft greens. Arthur stopped beneath it, awed. "What are these?" "Memories," the lady said, "of all who have come before. Every soul leaves a light behind." He looked up, and as the light swayed, he saw shapes within them, faces, faint as reflections in water. Knights, kings, children, strangers. Each one looked down at him, smiling. "Then this is heaven?" he asked. The lady shook her head. "No, it is something humbler. It is peace." They rested beneath the tree for a time. The lady spoke of the island, of how it had existed since the world was new, long before men learned to name their gods. "It was," she said, a place of balance, where the living and the lost might share one breath, where time slowed until it forgot to move at all. "Those who come here," she said, "are not taken. They are kept until they are needed again." Arthur looked toward the distant water, where the mists swirled like smoke. "And will I be needed again?" Her expression softened. "Britain sleeps, but it still dreams. And as long as it dreams of peace, your name will live within it. When the dream awakens, so shall you." He smiled faintly. "Then let me rest until that day." She guided him to a low stone chamber at the base of the great tree. Inside, the air glowed with a gentle blue light. The walls were carved with symbols that pulsed like breathing. A bed of moss lay in the centre, soft as cloud, warm as sunlight on skin. Arthur lay down upon it, his body easing into the stillness as though he were sinking into the very heart of the world. The lady knelt beside him. "Sleep now," she said. "The world you knew has passed, but its memory endures. You have done what no other could, turned war into hope, sorrow into legend." He looked at her through half-lidded eyes. "And what of you?" "I will keep the water still," she replied, "and wait for the ripples of your name." Outside, the island hummed softly. Time folded upon itself, seasons flowing together like colours in a dream. The apple trees bloomed and shed their petals without end. The stars above Avalon did not move, but glowed in slow rhythm with the earth below, as if both were breathing together. In the far distance, voices rose, faint, familiar. He heard Bedwyre's laughter, Lancelot's steady calm, Guinevere's song carried on the wind. He heard the clang of swords from long ago days, the soft murmur of counsel in the round hall, the whisper of parchment as Merlin wrote prophecies by candlelight. They came not as echoes, but as comfort, reminders that no life, however bright, ever truly disappears. Sometimes in the endless twilight, Arthur dreamed. He dreamed of Camelot, not the place it had become, but the way it had been. The smell of fresh-cut wood in the early halls, the clatter of builders' tools, the joy of beginnings. He dreamed of the round table, shining in torchlight, each seat filled with laughter and purpose. He dreamed of Guinevere's smile, warm and human and full of forgiveness. And he dreamed of a small boy once lost among the ruins of Rome, finding his destiny in a stone. Each dream faded gently, leaving behind the same peace that filled the air around him. When he woke, he would walk the island's meadows, his steps leaving no trace. The lady would sometimes join him, silent but kind, her eyes reflecting both dawn and dusk at once. "You are healing," she would say. "From what?" he would ask. "From being," she would reply. "Even greatness must rest." Years passed, though the word years meant little in Avalon. Outside the mists, centuries turned like pages in a forgotten book. Kings rose and fell. Faiths changed. The languages of men twisted and merged. Yet here, all remained still. Sometimes, from far across the water, faint sounds would reach the island. The call of a horn, the clash of iron, the cry of a world struggling to remember itself. Arthur would pause, listening, his heart stirring like wind over grass. And always, the lady would appear beside him. "Not yet," she would say. "The world is not ready for what it asks." And he would nod, turning back toward the great tree where his rest waited. There were nights when the stars burned brighter than usual, when even Avalon seemed to listen. On those nights, Arthur would climb the hill and stand beside the standing stones, looking outward. He could not see the world beyond the mists, but he could feel it, vast and distant, trembling with both pain and hope. He would lift his hand, as though to touch it, and whisper softly, "Hold fast, my people. The dream was never mine alone." Then he would lower his hand, and the island would grow quiet once more. And so the ages turned. The island remained, timeless, watchful, serene. The lady kept her vigil by the lake, her face unchanging. And beneath the silver branches of the great tree, Arthur slept on, his sword beside him, his heart in tune with the pulse of Avalon itself. No death touched him, for death has no power where time does not move. No sorrow found him, for sorrow cannot cross still waters. He simply was, a dream cradled within the dream of the earth. They say that on certain nights, when fog rolls over the moors and the wind hums low through the valleys, a faint glow appears upon the horizon, the reflection of an island that should not exist. Those who see it speak of bells faintly ringing, of music just beyond hearing, of peace that makes the heart ache. And sometimes they say, a voice drifts through the mist, calm, patient, eternal. I am here. When the land calls, I will return. Avalon sleeps, as does its king. The world turns. But in the heart of that island beyond time, the light of Camelot still burns, steady, waiting, and full of grace. Centuries have passed since the mists closed over Avalon. The rivers have changed their course, the forests have crept higher up the hills, and the stones of Camelot, if they ever truly stood, have long been reclaimed by the earth. But stories are stubborn things. They outlive the walls that held them, the men who spoke them, even the languages that once gave them breath. And so it is that the name of Arthur still drifts through the quiet places of Britain, through valleys where the fog lingers low, through the whispering trees, through the hush that falls just before dawn. They say his spirit moves with the land itself, sleeping beneath the roots and rivers, waiting for the day when peace must once again be defended by courage. No tomb has ever been found. No grave bears his crown. Only the echo remains, a voice carried through time, reminding those who listen that goodness, once born, never truly dies. In every age, the story has taken a new shape. The monks of Glastonbury swore they had seen a cross unearthed from the soil, engraved with the king's name. The bards of Wales sang that he would return in the hour of Britain's greatest need. The chroniclers of Europe wove his tale into their own, each changing a detail, each polishing a truth until it gleamed with legend. But beneath all the words, the heart of the story remained the same. A boy once pulled a sword from a stone. He built a dream from the ruins of despair. And when that dream fell, he laid it gently into the hands of time, trusting it would one day rise again. In the centuries that followed, kingdoms rose and crumbled. Empires claimed the earth only to lose it again to hunger and greed. Yet through it all, Arthur's name endured, not as a relic of conquest, but as a whisper of what humanity might be. When wars raged across fields that once knew peace, soldiers spoke of him in their trenches. The just king, the noble knight, the dream of unity that might still be possible. When poets searched for the soul of a fading world, they found him again in their verses, not as a warrior, but as a promise. And when children listened to their grandmothers by firelight, they heard of the boy who drew the sword and felt in their small hearts that maybe, just maybe, they could do the same. Time softened his story, as time softens all things. The sharpness of battle dulled into metaphor, the pain of loss turned to yearning. The men and women who had lived beside him became symbols of courage, of loyalty, of love and betrayal, of the fragile balance between hope and human weakness. Camelot became not a place, but a feeling, a vision that flickers within every soul that believes in something greater than themselves. Even the Round Table lived on in ways unseen. In the fairness of a council meeting where every voice is heard. In the quiet moment when one person defends another without thought of reward. In the steady hands that rebuild what cruelty has broken. For that was Arthur's true kingdom. Not the walls of stone, but the kindness that outlasted them. There are those who say that Avalon still breathes beneath the mists of the Western Isles. That when the wind blows from the sea, you can catch the scent of apple blossoms, though none grow there. That if you listen closely, you might hear the faint sound of water lapping against the side of an unseen boat. Fishermen speak of lights that shimmer across the lake at night, soft, white and distant, like candles floating on glass. They say that sometimes, just before dawn, a low sound rises from the depths, not a voice exactly, but something near to one, the sigh of a sleeping king. And in the morning, when the mist lifts, the water lies smooth and calm, as though nothing had ever stirred it. In the green heart of Britain, the hills still bear names that once belonged to Arthur's world. Caerleon, Tintagel, Glastonbury, places that hum faintly with memory. Travellers climb those slopes and stand in the wind, feeling something they cannot name. It is not belief exactly, nor nostalgia. It is the weight of story, the quiet knowing that beneath their feet lies the same soil that once held a dream. Sometimes, when the clouds break and sunlight spills across the land, they swear they see movement among the shadows. A flash of armour, a glint of steel, the fleeting shape of a man upon a hill, gazing out toward the horizon. By the time they blink, he is gone. But the feeling remains, as if the land itself had breathed, remembering. And perhaps it does remember, for the earth has long memory, and it keeps its secrets in the folds of its valleys and the depths of its rivers. It remembers the sound of hooves on stone, the laughter of builders raising Camelot's walls, the crack of thunder over Camlann. It remembers the cry of the newborn Arthur in a crumbling world, and the final sigh of the king as he drifted into Avalon's mist. It remembers, too, the dreams of those who came after, each one adding their own verse to the great song of hope. Every child who stands up for fairness, every heart that chooses mercy over might, they keep the rhythm of that song alive. And so, though the man is gone, the music remains. In old churches, his image lingers in coloured glass, a crowned figure with a sword, raised not in wrath, but in protection. In books, his story reshapes itself for every age that needs it. And in dreams, he rides again, quiet and sure, his cloak trailing the dust of the world that made him. He does not demand worship. He does not promise miracles. He simply rides, as he always has, toward the horizon, where light meets shadow, where the heart of humankind still struggles between what is and what might be. That is the true legacy of the once and future king, not his triumph, but his striving. For he reminds us that greatness lies not in victory, but in the courage to try again after failure. On certain nights, when the wind comes soft from the west and the stars burn low above the moors, the mists roll in thick and pale, covering the fields in silence. It is said that if you walk far enough into that mist, following the sound of water and the faint scent of apple blossom, you will find yourself standing before a still lake. Its surface will reflect not your face, but your heart. And if that heart is steady, if it carries the weight of kindness and the ache of hope, then perhaps you will see something move beneath the water. A flash of gold, the curve of a sword, the hand of the lady, rising once more to test the worth of humankind. But she does not call lightly, for the world must be ready to believe again in what it lost. When that day comes, the mists will open, and the barge will glide once more upon the water. And from Avalon's silver hills, the king will rise, not to conquer, but to guide. Until then, he sleeps, and the world dreams of him. In every corner of the earth where someone speaks his name, Arthur breathes again, not as flesh, but as faith. Faith that courage can outlast cruelty, that love, though flawed, can still redeem, that a single act of mercy can echo louder than any war. The Round Table is not gone. It lives wherever people gather to speak with honesty and listen with grace. It shines in every moment of fairness, every small act of justice, every quiet promise kept. That is the echo of the king, not in the clash of swords, but in the stillness that follows, when the world, for a heartbeat, remembers how to be kind. The mists will come again someday. They always do. And when they do, perhaps the hills will hum once more, and the rivers will quicken, and a faint voice will rise above the wind, calm and certain. I am Arthur, son of the island and keeper of the dream. I am not gone, only waiting, and those who hear will not be afraid. For they will know that the dream he carried has never left them. It lives in the quiet corners of their hearts, whispering that even in the darkest hour, light waits to return. And so the story ends, not in sorrow, but in stillness, in the peace that follows a long night. The fires of Camelot have burned to embers. The swords are at rest, and the king once mortal now belongs to the rhythm of the world itself. Close your eyes, listener. Let the echoes fade into silence. The river is calm, the stars are steady, the dream is safe, and somewhere far beyond the horizon of time, a king sleeps and smiles.